So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our intro to FDA regulations with the fabulous Alison Sathe. So Alison began her career as a biomedical engineer working with medical device startups, and she specialized in regulatory and quality affairs for more than 15 years. Previously an executive team member overseeing regulatory and quality affairs for a 100+ employee company with domestic and international sales. She has been regulatory lead for multiple product lines from concept and strategy through product release, including regulatory submissions and FDA clearance and approval. So Alison founded Regulatory Mark, which is a company that helps clients of all sizes find the right regulatory strategies for their products and their businesses. And she also founded ClearMark, an electronic QMS software platform specifically developed for medical device designers, developers, manufacturers, and entrepreneurs to help you develop products ahead of schedule and within budget. So thank you, Alison, for leading us off today and sharing all of your expertise with our attendees. We're very grateful to have you.
Great. Thank you so much, Audrey. I appreciate the intro. And thanks everyone for attending today. I know you guys have busy schedules. We have a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, and innovators on the call today. And so you're all doing a million things. Thanks for spending some time with us today. We really want to make sure that it's worth your while. So again, when you have specific questions about your product, your process, all of those things, bring those up. Raise your hand, put it in the chat, and we will try to address all of your questions. And without any further delay, we'll get into the content here. Maybe, let's see, there we go. First, I just wanted to say thank you to the Entrepreneur Center. Entrepreneur Center sponsoring this event. They are a fantastic group located in Dayton. And we work with quite a few of the companies that go through the Entrepreneur Center. And let me just say, if you're an entrepreneur or an innovator, reach out to them because they have fantastic resources for you to take advantage of. So definitely want to encourage that and say a special thanks to the Entrepreneur Center. And I see Paul's on. I don't know, Paul, did you want to say hello to everyone?
Just saying hi. And if you need anything at all, either direct message me or feel free to contact us after. Really, we're focused on the Dayton region, but we also help companies elsewhere through some of our national programs. So I'm here to answer questions if there are any after all of the great info you get from Alison.
Definitely encourage you guys to reach out to Paul. There's a lot of great resources out there for you. So today we're going to just talk a little bit about FDA, FDA Regulations and Medical Technology. So we'll just start out with a little bit about CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. We're going to talk through kind of two main areas, your product regulation and then your quality management system regulation. And what we found is a lot of folks are really familiar with your product regulation as entrepreneurs or startups. Obviously, that's where you're going to start, is thinking about your product. And we're also going to spend some time then on the quality management systems, the quality systems regulations for that quality aspect of the regulations as well. So we'll touch both. And again, we're going to have two kind of breaking points for discussions. So one will be after kind of the product specific content, and the other will be after the quality specific content. So first, we're going to just start talking a little bit about CDRH. CDRH is the office that we deal with, or the branch of FDA that we deal with all the time. There's, of course, drugs and biologics as well. We do handle some products that are going through the drug division as combination products, just the device portion of that. But this is where, if you've got a medical technology or medical device, your product is going to be regulated through CDRH. And of course, they evaluate new devices. They ensure compliance with both the pre-market and the post-market regulations. And there's a lot of outreach as well, of course, providing information to industry, consumers, healthcare professionals, lot of activity going on in the FDA and in CDRH. So just recently, well, I guess recently in kind of regulatory time, so later last year, the reorganization of CDRH was completed. So what they used to have were different divisions according to the product's life cycle. So they'd have kind of a pre-market review divisions with divisions in there. You'd have post-market and compliance divisions as well. rather than kind of this holistic approach, which they've taken recently. And the reorganization basically aligned the program functions along product life cycles or lines, enabling the FDA to kind of keep specific knowledge of those specific product types within one group to optimize the decision making across the life cycle. So that means the same group that might be reviewing your pre-market submission can be the ones that are also doing compliance activities post-market. And so that basically means you've got a lot of specialists in the FDA. You always have, but these folks are reviewing the same types of products and are really familiar with kind of these product lines and specific technologies. So a lot of expertise in those offices. This is kind of the overarching CDRH structure. We're not going to spend too much time on that. OPEC, the CDRH super office, is where you would be interacting most with the FDA. So the first interaction really is that pre-market review, whether that's in terms of a Q-sub or a pre-sub meeting, an informational meeting, all the way through kind of your either device listing, 510Ks, de novos, or PMAs. And you can see here, they've got specific divisions based on device type. And so again, you're going to see specialists that really understand this product area very, very deeply when you go to the FDA with your product. So the medical device classification process that FDA uses is a little bit different than those that you find in some international markets. So rather than having kind of a set of rules, which you'll see, for example, in Europe, in the MDR, which you see in Canada, in other regions, FDA classifies by device types. So they're organized by medical specialties, and each generic device type is assigned to one of 3 regulatory classes based on the level of control necessary to ensure the safety and effectiveness of the device. And so you'll hear references to class 1, 2, and 3 devices in the United States. And I'm wondering, are people familiar right now, if you're developing a technology, are people familiar with their device type or understand their classification? Or are most of the folks on the call just exploring that? And Audrey, I don't know if we can launch that poll question or if people just kind of want to type in the chat and let us know what their device types are or if they know their devices. Yep, so we've got some that are saying they're not familiar. So we'll just kind of go into how you kind of get that regulatory strategy together, or how we think about getting that regulatory strategy together. Great, so some people are already really familiar and understand their product type and pathway. So when FDA is looking at the classification of devices and the marketing pathway, they assess a couple of different things. What's your intended use? What's your indications for use? And what's your technological characteristics? And so really you want to start developing your regulatory strategy when you have these items reasonably defined. And I always say it's really good to start early. I always think you should kind of start with 2 things when you're starting a project. One, your IP, because you really want to protect your invention or your product. And then 2, you want to look at your regulatory strategy, because that's going to define not just your process with the agency, but all of those activities that lead up to those processes. So for example, the type of testing that you need to perform in your design and development activities, the content of that 510K, what experts you're going to need on your project, all of those are input into kind of your design process. And when you understand those upfront, you can kind of prevent a lot of surprises down the road. It's always good to understand, in general, the types of testing that you're going to need to do early so you can budget, plan effectively, all of those things. The device classification are sections of the Code of Federal Regulations that govern the device. So when you look in the product code database, you'll see a couple of different things. One of those is the device class, so class 1, 2, or 3. And then the other you'll see is that set of numbers that corresponds to the Code of Federal Regulations. And that's really the definition of your device. Each device may have several different product codes associated with it. So in terms of the actual device regulation under the CFR, you'll have that definition and description there and special controls. but you may have various product codes that would be associated with that regulation. So honing in on your specific product code for your product is really important. That's going to help you decide really important things in terms of your regulatory strategy, like what is your predicate device that you're going to use if you're a class 2 510K device. You can also get lots of regulatory intelligence in terms of testing strategies, harmonized standards, guidance documents. All of those are really invaluable as you start your process and understand what your design and development activities are going to be. Product codes may distinguish between component and accessories. So that's another thing. If you've got a multiple part system, you might have a parent product with accessory products. There are different ways to approach those. So previously, I think there was a guidance, gosh, it might have been 2 years ago now that came out, but previously FDA really defined accessories by the parent device. So if you have more than one product that you're providing, the parent device classification would always take precedent. FDA then, I believe it was in the 21st Century's Cures Act, changed that definition of the accessories. So accessories could then stand alone. And they actually now have a novel kind of pathway that you can do a Q-sub to reclassify an accessory. If you, for example, have a PMA product, it's a class 3 product, you can get that reclassified as an accessory into a lower product risk level. And again, clarifying those risk-based factors that determine your compliance requirements, really important to do upfront in your regulatory strategy, and regulatory intelligence is really key for that. So here's just a couple of examples of product code searches. And you can see, I love the FDA databases, and now there's actually lots of softwares that you can use to help augment your FDA database searches. And those can be really valuable. You know, your regulatory internal person or regulatory professional might be able to utilize some of those softwares that are available to do some more advanced searches. These are just two kind of pullouts from the FDA databases, and you can see, you know, if you search for syringes, this is just half of the listings that are available. But under that regulation number here, you have various product codes that are listed, and there's different, of course, areas of regulation for any given type of product. You can see on the right side, you've got your device classification. So whether that is a class 1, 2, or 3 device, here you can see HDE, you've got a humanitarian device exemption device type here. And you also might see unclassified devices listed, and those would be pre-amendment devices or non-classified devices, which would be post-amendment devices that don't yet have a submission. So there's just a couple of things that you might see there in your device classification. And really going in and doing these searches can be really beneficial, whether that's, you know, you as a manager or a quality or regulatory professional. Really going in and getting this information up front is so key to your planning and strategy. So as we mentioned, there's 3 types of classifications of devices. Class 1 are the lowest risk devices, and those require just general controls. Those might be something like a toothbrush or a gauze pad or something like that. Those types of products require, we'll go into it in a little bit, but those require device listing and registration. They do have regulatory compliance requirements, and they may or may not be exempt from GMPs. And we'll get into that a little bit in the second half of this presentation, where we talk through good manufacturing practices, quality management systems, and what that means. There are very few class 1 devices that are exempt also from the GMPs. So even if you have a low risk device, thinking about what your quality management system should look like upfront is really important, because again, that's going to determine a big part of your project in terms of cost, timelines, and even infrastructure of your company if you're going to put in a quality management system to support your product and your processes. Class 2 devices are where most devices fall in terms of the work that we do. These are medium risk devices. So these products have general and special controls. These products are things like laparoscopes and general surgery products. A lot of dental products are class 1 or class 2 products. And these typically require a 510K. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with 510Ks and have heard that before. And again, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute in terms of what's a 510K, how do you kind of approach that, that planning process for a 510K submission. And a 510K is really a pre-market submission, whereas class 1 products generally do not require that. Class 2 products generally do require a 510K. And then you have class 3 products. Class 3 products are high-risk products or those for which there's no predicate device. And this is a really important distinction, especially with a lot of really innovative technologies. So you might have a product that is medium to low risk. And as part of that, what you need to do is find a predicate device in order to do a 510K. A predicate device has to be substantially equivalent to the subject device. So if you have a product with novel indications, novel technology, different areas of use, those are the types of things that might make you fit into this kind of automatic class 3 designation because you're low risk, but you don't have a predicate device. And that's a process that you would follow then called the de novo process in order to have pre-market compliance with that type of product. And we'll get into that in a minute as well. Class 3 devices, again, high risk, those typically require a pre-market approval or a PMA. And you can really kind of view these classifications, not just from the risk level, but intuitively also, as you would expect, the level of documentation for each of these types or classifications of device gets progressively more rigorous. So class 1 devices, general controls, class 2 devices, general and special controls, and then class 3 devices have to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. Now, class 2 devices have to demonstrate substantial equivalence. And so those are a subtle distinction between kind of those class 2 510K and class 3 PMA devices. So pre-market requirements, we talked a little bit about this. Pre-market requirements for all devices include establishment registration and device listing. That is something that you do through FDA's establishment registration portal. Very easy to do. You can go in, create an account and register and pay the fee. And every company has to pay the fee every year. And it's the same price for every company. Usually it's around $5,000 for in the past couple of years and going forward, but they change it every year in terms of exactly what that cost is. You're obligated to keep your device listing up to date. So when you go in, you register your establishment. That's basically the place you're doing business and what functions you're performing. So you might register as a manufacturer or a specification developer or a contract manufacturer or a repackager and relabeler. All of those are done through the establishment registration and device listing portal. And then in terms of device listing, your device is listed, and again, this is all done just through the portal, either when you're going to market your device, if you have a class 1 device, when you get your 510K, if you're a class 2 510K device, or when you get your PMA approval, if you're a class 3 device. 510Ks or pre-market notifications, that's probably where most people on this call would be. That's kind of the majority of submissions to the FDA are these 510K submissions. As we mentioned before, the pre-market submissions are made to demonstrate that the device is at least as safe and effective or substantially equivalent to a legally marketed predicate device. So that process differs a little bit from what we would see in the pre-market application. So in the pre-market application, you're providing assurance of safety and effectiveness. In the pre-market notification or 510K, you're providing substantial equivalence. 510Ks have 20 sections. They are, well-defined. Your regulatory professional or personnel will know kind of what's expected to go into each of those sections. And one of the keys to that is making sure that you're providing the right testing. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. De novo classification requests are for those products that we mentioned on the previous slide that are low-risk medical devices, but don't have a legally marketed predicate. So you can't demonstrate substantial equivalence through the 510K process. Basically, it's a reclassification order. So when you do a de novo with the FDA, they are basically saying, default, you were class 3 because there's no predicate. And now we're going to reclassify you as class 1 or 2. And then after that initial de novo request, you or anyone else on the marketplace can then do a 510K within that product code using that device as a predicate or anything that's subsequently cleared as a predicate device. So that's an important distinction as well for folks to understand is if you do a de novo initially, you may be able to do 510Ks later on for similar devices, changes to that device, et cetera. And then of course you have PMAs or premarket approvals. That's the most stringent level of application with the FDA. And again, you need to assure safety and effectiveness and have valid scientific evidence to support that. PMAs are very large applications, very large documents, and include a wide range of information, not just pertaining to your product, but also to your quality management system as well. And there's panel tracks for PMAs where they have panels that will review your submission and make a recommendation. And then there's non-panel track PMAs as well. One of the things that we think about in any planning process for your regulatory strategy is the testing that's going to go into these. And one of the most important things to think about up front is the need for clinical data. So clinical data in the United States, and we won't talk about the EU right now because of course with MDR, everybody's talking about CERs and we won't kind of go into that. We'll focus on the United States. But in the United States, clinical trials are certainly required for PMAs, often required for de novos, depending on what it is, maybe, maybe not, and sometimes required for 510Ks. So it really depends on your device type, the regulatory history in that landscape, and what you're claiming for your device. So that's always something to consider up front because of course, clinical trials are a big part of your process in terms of cost and time. We talked a little bit about device registration and listing. So here's just kind of that FDA portal. This is very easy to do by yourselves. So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Obviously, we're always happy to help people with whatever they need, but CDRH has a great CDRH Learn about how to go in and register your device in your establishment and do those listings. So that's something that you can certainly do. And again, that's just something every year that has to be renewed and pay, you have to pay that fee. So we talked a little bit about 510Ks. And again, 510Ks are that substantial equivalence determination. Is anybody in the process of writing a 510K or planning for a 510K? If you are, just let us know in the chat. And if you have any specific questions about that, do raise those questions. So we've got some people in process. That's great. A 510K is a big submission to the agency. You want to make sure that you're including the right information in testing. And I know because we've got a lot of kind of managers and entrepreneurs and leaders on this call, I will say oftentimes when you're in that business mindset, you're thinking about that cost. And really the 510K, the cost for a 510K is not in the submission itself in terms of the fee for FDA, it's really in that testing. And so the testing that you need to do that's going to go into that 510K notification is really important. Another kind of way to view 510Ks or things to keep in mind as you're considering your 510K is you might have a very well-defined list of testing that you need to put in your 510K. So for example, everybody knows you're going to have to put in section 15 biocompatibility, which is a huge ticket item for FDA right now. Biocompatibility, you want to budget for those costs because those costs can be high, the timelines are long for that biocompatibility testing. So those are kind of things to keep in mind, that you will have specific tests that you have to put into your 510K, but that might not be all of the tests that you're doing in design and development. And so when we're looking at design and development activities, a portion of that will go into the FDA in terms of your 510K, but it's not comprehensive in terms of everything that you need to do for your design and development of your product. Here's a couple of examples of 510K devices that just show the range of devices that you see under Class 2 products. So you've got a Sharps bin, looks relatively simple, and then you've got the Da Vinci robotic surgical system, which is all three of those products kind of on that lower right-hand side. Obviously, in terms of complexity, design, testing, requirements, those are vastly different projects. And yet the 510K process can accommodate both of those. And that's why oftentimes, all of us want more clarity with FDA, but this 510K process is really great because it does provide that flexibility for FDA to assure that these safe and effective medical devices can reach the market, even though they're vastly, vastly different. And the interesting part is both the Sharps container and the Da Vinci product will have a lot of the same sections of their 510K. They're going to look a lot different in terms of testing, in terms of the amount of testing that needs to be done for each of those, but the general layout of the submissions is the same. And again, obviously the Da Vinci will have a lot more testing and a lot more rigorous testing than a Sharps bin, but the 510K process is the same for both. Oh, and one thing we didn't mention on the slide in particular, but just a little bit about review times. So I generally tell people plan on 6 months for a 510K once you submit it. That might be a little long, but FDA has a review time of 90 days. But what they do is basically you submit the 510K. There's an administrative portion called the RTA, or refusal to accept timeframe, where FDA is actually reviewing the content of your submission to make sure it's all there, it's all accurate, and you're not missing anything. Once you get beyond that 15 days, then your review enters the substantive review section. Substantive review is when you're assigned a reviewer and a review team, and they're reviewing all of the parts of your document. They will then stop the clock at 60 days, usually, not always. Sometimes, if they don't have any substantive questions, they might have interactive review questions that they'll email you. They might have interactive review questions and then still stop for an AI request. All those are possibilities. But once you get that additional information request, that's when your clock stops. And FDA gives you time to respond to their questions. Typically, that's 180 days because of COVID. There have been some extensions. And because of COVID, I will say, particularly in terms of if additional biocompatibility testing or external testing needs to be done, those timelines can get really long right now because those labs are very full and are also facing shortages in terms of personnel. So that's when that timeline stops. The company is given a chance to respond. And then once you submit your responses, there's about those 30 days left, depending on when they stop the clock. If they stopped it at 60, then there's 30 days left. And after that time frame, that's when you'll get your response from the agency. Any questions on 510K? I don't know if we want to pause for a minute and ask any questions quickly here. No? Okay. De novo submissions. So I don't know, is anybody planning on doing a de novo? Again, I know there's lots of entrepreneurs on this call and startups. De novos have gained popularity in the recent years. The de novo program has been around for a long time, but they recently restructured the program such that you didn't have to have a non-substantially equivalent determination prior to doing the de novo process. Previously, you had to try to do a 510K, have that be found non-substantially equivalent, and then do a de novo. Now you can do a de novo submission right out of the gate. And that's really important because we're seeing lots of development in technology that's really, really exciting, but you might not have a predicate device. And so FDA has kind of made use of this de novo program or pathway that says when you have a low risk device, you don't need to classify it as a default class 3. It can be put into class 2 or 1 based on safety and effectiveness data. The de novo submissions look a little different than either the 510K or the PMA submissions, because it's basically a request for reclassification. So not only are you providing information for the safety and effectiveness of your device, but you're providing things like risk assessments and proposals for special controls that would assure safety and effectiveness for your product. Oops, let's see here. So some examples of de novo products, a lot of IVDs going through the de novo pathway, but we've got a wide range, as you can see. So everything from an IPL treatment for dry eye, which is interesting because, of course, IPL treatments have been on the market for dermatological applications for many, many years. But for a treatment for dry eye and MGD, that is a new indication. And so it went through the de novo pathway. You've got a radio frequency powered toothbrush, endoscopic instruments, and this is one of my favorites, the video game to improve attention function in children with ADHD. I think that's just really fascinating. That's definitely new for FDA to be clearing a video game, and just kind of indicative of the exciting time it is, I feel like, to work in this industry when you have such a wide range of treatment options. PMAs. I don't know if anyone on the line is doing a PMA. We won't spend too much time on this because I'm guessing that there's not a lot. There aren't a lot of PMA products that go through. Oh, go ahead. Oh, maybe not. Maybe it's just an unmute. But PMA products, they're definitely the minority of products that go through. Most devices are class 1 or 2. There are class 3 devices are highest risk. And so those are those that are supporting or sustaining human life, preventing of substantial importance and preventing impairment of human health, or present a very high risk. PMA devices, again, have to meet that threshold of safety and effectiveness. So with PMAs, you're seeing much larger studies that are going in to support these submissions versus what we would kind of see as like safety studies or studies that demonstrate substantial equivalence for the lower risk devices. There are lots of different aspects of a PMA submission, as I mentioned. Part of that are quality inspections, huge amounts of information in terms of your quality management system and controls. All of those types of information are submitted in PMAs. Also, one thing to mention is post-market. So PMAs also include post-market activities and compliance requirements that are above and beyond those requirements for the lower classifications of devices. Some examples of PMAs for high-risk devices. You've got a ventricular assist device, knee replacement systems, cosmetic fillers, a lot of implants in this category, resorbable meshes, things like that. And then I want to mention also special programs. So there are some special programs for pre-market pathways. One of those are EUAs. We're hearing a lot about EUAs right now, of course, with COVID, and the amount of EUAs that are going through the agency, I believe, is unprecedented. There are a lot of applications going through, and of course, where we're seeing those is on the drug side with, vaccinations and treatments, but on the device side, a whole range of products. So everything from masks, ventilators, IVDs, diagnostics, all of these things are being prioritized through the emergency use authorization process. And it's important to note, if you do have an EUA product, I think I saw somebody's manufacturing masks. And if that is being planned through an EUA, that's great. That can go through the EUA, and then that needs to be followed on by the pre-market submission that would dictate that device class. So you might be able to get to the market faster with that EUA, and certainly would, rather than the traditional 510K or de novo or PMA that you'd be doing. But it needs both. Or if not, then it has to be pulled off the market when the emergency is over. So the emergency use authorization program is one thing to keep in mind based on priority. So FDA will prioritize and deprioritize different products, not just in accordance with their utility in the emergency, but also with the amount of product that's on the market. So if they say we have sufficient level of supply for XYZ that is in the market, let's say they said we have sufficient level of home tests, which they don't, but if they did, they might deprioritize any home test that would be coming through. So that's their at their discretion, and typically that is also not made public. So that's something just to kind of keep in the back of your mind with EUAs. They also have issued lots of templates this time around with EUAs, which is really exciting, I think. So, you know, they're definitely working very hard to make sure that these devices can be cleared under the emergency use authorization, or I guess authorized, I should say. The Breakthrough Devices program is a great program that is to for technologies that provide more effective treatments for life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. Breakthrough Devices, like the STEP program listed below, is totally voluntary. So those are programs that you can apply for, but they're not required. What both the Breakthrough Devices program and the STEP program do are prioritize your review, allow more flexible interactions with FDA, and they also have some language in some of the guidance about considering more creative clinical trial design. So things like taking into account real world evidence. I will say both of those programs, it's more like a sprint. So it's not that you have a different standard that you have to meet. You have to meet the same standard, of course. But because of the interactions with the agency, it's a very fast process where there's a lot of communications back and forth. And again, that STEP program, that's for devices that are novel or present a novel application, but also that it's for underlying diseases or conditions that are less serious than those for the Breakthrough Devices program. So just a subtle distinction between the two. Q-subs and pre-subs. Is anyone planning on doing a Q-sub with the FDA or a pre-sub with the FDA? They have gained a lot of popularity recently with good reason. I think they can provide a lot of clarity to sponsors, to manufacturers, and they should be utilized carefully and well. Pre-submissions are all voluntary. You're never required to have a pre-sub meeting. Great, yes to pre-subs. We've got a couple people doing that. That's awesome. They are, again, totally voluntary, and it's an opportunity to interact with the FDA prior to your submission. So that could be a pre-IDE meeting where you're getting feedback about the risk. Is it a non-significant risk or significant risk study? It can be prior to your 510K. If you have questions about your regulatory strategy, your planned indication statements, your testing that you're going to provide in that submission. This is the opportunity for you to work with the FDA beforehand to get feedback on how you're going to proceed. That can ease your path to market by making sure that the FDA concurs with your approach. It can also lead to more questions, and that's why we have this kind of disclaimer here. Ensure it's at the right time with the right content. You want to be really specific when you're asking questions to the agency, because what you don't want to do is end up with a lot of feedback that then you have to disposition or address that might not be applicable to your product or pathway. And that's why when we're looking at the right content, you want to make sure that you have the right content in that pre-sub request so that FDA can give you good targeted feedback. If they don't, again, then you're left with kind of a larger mess of dispositioning all of this other information that might not be applicable to you. And that's also part of your record with the FDA. So part of your process when you submit a 510K, say, is what were your prior interactions with the agency? And the FDA will pull those, they'll pull your pre-subs so that they can kind of build that bridge and that story about your product and the interactions that you've had before. So just something to keep in mind when you're planning those. Just a few notes on the specific types of Q-subs. So there's also SIRs, submission information request meetings. So this would be when you've got a marketing submission in process and there's a hold placed for that additional information request. You can formally request feedback from the agency in an SIR. And so that's when you've got a question where maybe they give you a question and you don't believe that the way they suggest addressing it is the right way to proceed. You've got another way that's actually, more scientifically valid, least burdensome, et cetera. You can do that in an SIR, make that proposal and get FDA's feedback on that. Now, it's not necessary for simple clarifications. If you have a quick question, you can call your reviewer or email them that quick question. Again, always be careful when you're interacting with the agency, but you can certainly do that. The SIR is for when you want, as part of the record, significant feedback or written feedback on your planned approach. Again, being prepared, having the right data, and asking really specific questions is really key for the process when you're conducting a submission information request meeting. Other types of Q-subs we talked about, study risk determination meetings. Again, if you want to know whether you're significant risk or non-significant risk, informational meetings, those are less frequently conducted, especially by smaller organizations. Typically, you go in with a pre-sub rather than an informational. PMA 100-day meetings. Again, if you want to do the Breakthrough Devices program or the STEP program or accessory classification requests that we mentioned previously, if you want to reclassify an accessory to a parent product, you can do that through the Q-sub. So a couple notes about pre-market pathways, and I just put these in because I find these are a lot of the questions that we get from entrepreneurs, startups, people new to the regulations. They have some of these questions. So class 1 devices are generally exempt and class 2 devices generally require 510K. That's not always the case. So just because you're a moderate risk device doesn't mean you're going to have to do a 510K. Maybe you're exempt. That would be awesome. Probably not the case, but you might need a de novo. And it really depends on a lot of different things in your regulatory landscape. Again, we talked about the de novo submission, and after that de novo submission, anyone coming after you in that product space can use your product as a 510K or as a predicate device to do a 510K rather than a de novo. So there's no repeat de novos within the same product category. And then pre-market submissions are only a portion of the regulation. We kind of mentioned that. The second half of this is going to be focused on quality management systems. And so obviously you need to focus on your product and your process, but keep in mind the whole other system of quality systems regulations that need to be complied with, particularly in your design and development activities, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what are a few things that we should be doing just in our pre-market pathway process? Start early. I think starting early is really important. Considering where you are in the landscape and what you need to be doing to ensure compliance is really key, because again, that impacts your entire project, your team structure, your organization, et cetera. Those compliance requirements are so important to understand. And of course, if we've got people that are going out and fundraising, that's a question that your investors are going to ask is, how well do you know your regulatory space and your regulatory requirements? Revisit often. So this is a really key one, especially when you're starting up. Maybe you started early and you've got a regulatory plan in place, and then you have to go out and do your fundraising. And that's going to take you 6 to 9 months. And now you're ready to start your project. You got to understand what happened in those 6 to 9 months. It could be lots of different things. So you could have a new product code in your space, maybe a new de novo just got reclassified, and you've got a new product that's in your space that you need to understand. Maybe there was a new guidance document that's specific to your device type that was issued. All of those things impact your submission in your pre-market pathway, and so you should revisit that often. One example that I like to see is we actually had a 510K where it was about a week and a half before we were submitting, and the predicate device that we had was recalled. And so, we needed to put some language in there to say, the predicate device was just recalled, and here's why that's not applicable to our product, or here's the difference there, or here's how that doesn't apply. And I think those are the types of things that let your regulatory bodies know that you're really on top of your product, your pathway, and really understand the landscape for your product. Having the right experts. So obviously you need regulatory input, you need quality input, engineers, clinicians, veterinarians, toxicologists, all of those are so important, because a regulatory submission is not just written by your regulatory professional or the regulatory person on your team. Really, you need to have a team in place that can support those activities. And, when we talk about engineers, the engineering and regulatory collaboration on these is so important. And really what you want to understand is, on the FDA side, they're going to have their team reviewing it, right? So they're going to have their veterinarian reviewing your animal study. They're going to have a toxicologist reviewing your biocompatibility section. Those are the types of professionals that you want to make sure you have on your team, so you can speak directly to their team. Use FDA resources. They've got great resources, well, sometimes great resources. They have a lot of great resources for guidances, standards, and there's a new Biocompatibility Resource Center, which just got launched, I think maybe 2 weeks ago. It's kind of cool. That Biocompatibility Resource Center is so key, because biocompatibility is one of the most frequently asked questions by FDA. And the content that they have in that resource center is not really new from the guidance that was issued a number of years ago. But what they do have there is an email address. So if you have a specific biocompatibility question, you can get that answered via email now. And that's great. So FDA is definitely trying to come out with more and more resources. I think they're doing a great job of providing guidance. And so it's our job to kind of know where that is, know how it pertains to our products. And ensuring that your application requirements and deliverables are addressed as part of your design and development activities. And so as part of your design and development, again, what we said was design and development is a larger process. Part of that is your regulatory submission. And so just making sure that you're not kind of viewing those two things separately. They're all integrated, and all those activities kind of need to speak to one another, essentially, or need to be integrated. And so just as an example, addressing the applicable standards and FDA guidances in things like your requirements specifications, those are important. Understanding what harmonized standards or recognized standards are applicable to your product type, and making sure you're doing those verifications, validations, testing in accordance with those. And of course, there's lots of professionals out there that if you are an entrepreneur or innovator, there's lots of resources out there to help you with those design and development activities that do a fantastic job. I know, I think actually Jill's on this call from Integrity Development. They do fantastic work. There's lots of resources out there for you for design and development activities, but making sure that that's part of your regulatory pathway is so important. And so that's kind of the stop of, or the break for part one. Next, we're gonna go to quality management systems. Again, that was a really high level overview, but that's what this meeting is today. I'd love to take a few minutes and talk through any questions you guys have about regulatory strategy, pre-market submissions, pre-market requirements, anything that you guys want to put in the chat. Or Audrey, I don't know if we have a poll that we can push out.
Yeah, so folks can also feel free, if you want to unmute and jump in and ask Alison a question directly. Alison, do you want me to run these 4 poll questions that you had prepped?
Yeah, I think we had a couple were kind of for the beginning, but that's okay. I think we had a couple about kind of the pre-market pathway. If you wanted to push those out, that would be awesome.
Okay.
And while we kind of, let's see, okay, we've got some. For a 510K, does a predicate device need to be similar technology or similar performance? Very good question. So when we're looking at substantial equivalence for 510Ks, the FDA takes into account Well, actually, the best way to look at it is FDA's flowchart. So there's a guidance document determining substantial equivalence in 510Ks. And this flowchart, I think every regulatory professional knows it well. The first step in that flowchart is, does it have the same intended use? That's what FDA will look at first. And they'll look at your indication statement, your labeling, but also things like your device design. Is it designed for this use? Are off-label uses going to be included in that use, et cetera? And actually, FDA, I think it was in 2015 and 2017, and then just recently pushed out notifications for talking about the differences in intended use and where they actually define that. So it's not just in your indication statement, but it's also throughout your labeling, again, in your product design, et cetera. So that's the first thing they look at is your intended use the same? That doesn't mean that the indication statement has to be word for word, although that is helpful. If you can do that, that is really helpful. But it needs to be the same. And again, in section 12, which is your substantial equivalence section of your 510K, you'll walk FDA through that in terms of, if your statements are different, why are they still considered the same intended use if your indication statement's different? With regard, the second stop on that list is technological characteristics. So that's what we're talking about here in terms of technology and performance. And so the technological characteristics also have to be the same. If they're different, it's incumbent upon the company to provide a data that can demonstrate that there are no new types of questions of safety and effectiveness for the device. And that might take a lot of different forms. That might be something like, let's say your device has a different geometry and is harder to clean. You might provide a cleaning and disinfection validation that demonstrates that even though it may be harder to clean or have a novel feature, it's still as safe and effective because it can be cleaned. That's the kind of gaps that we're talking about, that data that you're providing fills in for the FDA. And so that's what we're looking at in terms of technological characteristics. Again, in your substantial equivalence section, that's where you'll put together that story for FDA of, here's how we're substantially equivalent, even though we might be different in X, Y, and Z areas. In terms of performance, I'll give you the standard regulatory answer, which is it depends. It depends on what kind of performance we're talking about. And I think this kind of gets to the heart of, when are clinical trials required for your 510K? And that's definitely something to take a look at in advance. There's a couple of things that you want to look at. One, have clinical trials been required for other devices in this area? Is that just kind of standard? Two, what are the differences from your predicate in terms of performance or in terms of intended use that might require, say, prompt FDA to say, we need a safety study to understand if this is really safe and effective? Those are all types of things to think through. And, I'd be happy to talk to you about it after as well if you have questions in terms of your particular device. Second question on combination products. So combination products are regulated through the device lead where the primary mode of action takes place. So for example, if you have a drug that is going to be packaged in a syringe and or an auto injector, then that drug has the primary mode of action, and the device would go through the drug side as an NDA, an IND through the drug branch, but with a device consult. So both branches of the agency would still be working on that product, but the primary pathway is dependent on the primary mode of action. Let's say you've got a drug-eluting stent. Again, that primary mode of action then is the stent. That would get reviewed as a PMA, but they would have folks from CDER, from the drug side, consult on that PMA. And so really you have to fulfill both areas of the regulation. You have to comply with the drug side, you have to comply with the device side, but the lead reviewer or the lead review branch will be determined. And you can do a request for designation if you want to know who's your lead review branch. That's something that you can do early if there's any questions about that, et cetera. So that's just a little bit about combination products. What is the typical process in a combination device with two separate predicate devices? Okay, this is a really good question because that applies to not just combination products, but regular products as well if you've got two predicates. I think it was in 2014 when FDA put out a guidance that said, no split predicates, we don't want that at all. And that was a draft guidance that was then later retracted. And FDA doesn't want split predicates. And what the point they were kind of trying to make in that guidance is you can't take an indication for use here, a technology over here, and think you're substantially equivalent when you put them together. Or you can't take half the technological characteristics of this and half the technological characteristics of this and put them together necessarily. Now, what you can do is have I kind of won't get into the nuance between kind of the predicate and reference devices, but you can rely on more than one device in your substantial equivalence discussion, particularly if you have something that has one novel technological characteristics, which is very well understood in another area. So let's say, for example, you've got a product and you're using maybe a novel material in this product that's really well characterized in another set of products. You can leverage that information from that other set of products or standards or whatever that might be, and use that as data to demonstrate substantial equivalence. Whenever you don't have a straightforward predicate device, that's always something that really bears fleshing out because it does get complicated when you're trying to use two different types of products to demonstrate substantial equivalence for one. There are certainly ways it can be done though. Great.
So real quick results from the first poll question. Which statement best describes your product regulatory strategy? Just starting to understand regulatory requirements is about 44% of the folks on the call. Have an idea is about 13%. Well understand is about 31%. And then 13% in the other category. And then I've got one more poll question that will start here. If you guys want to weigh in, which statement best describes your quality management system?
Awesome. And we'll actually wait for the results of this poll to start in on our next section. And again, if you guys have any questions with pre-market, still put them in the chat. We've got time to talk through those and happy to do that. Let's see. So hopefully, we'll see what those results are for the polling. And you can interrupt me, Audrey, when we have those poll results done.
No worries. Got a little over half have voted so far.
In the second section of the presentation, we're going to talk about quality systems regulations. And I find that this is the area where most kind of entrepreneurs and startups, if they're not familiar with the medtech space, this is the most hidden from them because it's not the thing you think about most. When you think about your product, you're thinking, how do I get my product approved or cleared by the FDA? How do I get this through the FDA? The thing that's less thought about, but really important, are your quality systems regulations and the quality management system that you have to support your compliance with the QSR. You'll also hear the quality systems regulations referred to as GMPs or CGMPs, which are current good manufacturing practices. The quality systems regulation applies to finished device manufacturers that commercially distribute medical devices. So this is really key, right? Because if you're a finished device manufacturer who is going to commercially distribute medical devices, when does that regulation apply to you? Does it apply if you're building a few prototypes, if you're doing a little test? When does that start? And that's something that we'll really get into. And again, there's lots of great resources out there in terms of design, development, lots of experts that can help you think through some of these aspects of your organization. So when do you want to implement? What do you need to implement? What do you do in-house versus outsourcing? All those are really important questions to ask yourself, especially as you're starting up. The QSR is defined in 21 CFR 820. And oh, good. I see we've got a couple questions already on DHF versus regulatory submission and the advantage to MDSAP or MedSAP. And I will answer both of those in just a second. So that's great. Keep them coming.
Allison, I'm going to share the results real quick. Can you see those?
Awesome. Great. Great. So we've got kind of a split. So we've got some folks who are really just starting to think about their quality management systems. We've got some in the middle, and then we've got people who are well on their way. So that's great. We've got people across the board. So feel free to send any of those questions out as you have them. For the folks that are kind of still just figuring out what's a quality management system, 21 CFR 820 is the standard, or the Code of Federal Regulations space to be aware of in the United States. You'll also hear the terms ISO 13485. We've got a slide on that in just a couple minutes. That's the international standard for quality systems for medical devices. So in the United States, if you're planning on just manufacturing and distributing here in the US, you are not required to comply with ISO 13485. You are required to comply with 21 CFR 820. The ISO standard and the FDA standard are non-competitive. They do overlap for a lot of what they're requiring, but there are distinct areas of both that don't overlap. So just something to keep in mind. If you're US only, the focus is on 21 CFR 820. There might be advantages to certifying to 13485 or the MDSAP program. And so those are all things to consider as you start thinking about what your quality management system is going to look like. So manufacturers are responsible to establish the requirements for each type or family of devices, making sure that they're safe and effective. And so this is done by establishing methods and procedures to design, produce, distribute, et cetera, to meet the demand, the quality management system requirements. This basically looks like sets of procedures and activities that the company performs, the records that they generate in the performance of those activities to demonstrate that they're doing things in a compliant way. And that's what FDA will come in and audit, or your ISO auditor or your MDSAP auditor will come in and audit those records and procedures as evidence that you're complying with the requirements. So this is an interesting thing. They say the responsibilities may not be delegated by manufacturers, although the work may be delegated. And that's a really important distinction as well. As a manufacturer, you're responsible. So if you're saying, okay, I'm an innovator, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm just going to have the idea of the device and I'm going to contract out the design and then I'm going to contract out the manufacturer, that's awesome. You can totally do that. However, you're still responsible for making sure that those suppliers are complying with 21 CFR 820, that those manufacturers are complying with those requirements. The legal responsibility still resides with you as the manufacturer. So those are just kind of interesting things to note. If you're delegating those activities, that delegation needs to be done in a very prescribed way with the right documentation in place. I'm a huge fan of quality agreements. You got to have them. And so that's just something to keep in mind as you're choosing your suppliers. There are some exemptions from the GMP requirements, although you still need record keeping and complaints at all times. Everybody just has to do that. But those are few and far between for some very few class 1 devices. Exemptions from pre-market submission. So you might have a class 2 product that is exempt from a 510K that is not exempt from the quality system regulations. So it's important to know, and that's all information that you get with when you understand your product code and your regulatory landscape, et cetera. So definitely something to keep in mind there. So one thing that I like to mention, especially when we're looking at startups, is the flexibility of the quality system requirements or regulations. FDA doesn't prescribe how you have to produce a device. There's leeway in the details of how your quality system elements work. The QSR is really a framework for manufacturers to develop and follow procedures appropriate to your device. And you're responsible as the manufacturer or the legal manufacturer, even if you're not doing the manufacturing yourself in-house, is to establish the requirements for each device type and family to result in a safe and effective device, establish the procedures to design, produce, distribute, et cetera, the devices, and have objective evidence, again, those records that show that you're meeting these requirements. So the manufacturer's responsibility, it doesn't mean your quality system has to look like the quality system of the medical device manufacturer next door. There is flexibility in how you do things. What you have to do is make sure that you're compliant with the regulations and that might look a little different for each company, especially when you're looking at big companies versus small companies. Inherently, those quality systems are going to look a little bit different, and that's okay. But what you do want to do is make sure that you're compliant. We did mention ISO 13485, which again is that international standard. You don't necessarily have to comply in the United States, although there are advantages to getting certified, notably the MDSAP program. If you decide to do ISO 13485 along with MDSAP, you can get all those certifications at one time. There is an effort within FDA to harmonize. So they're originally in 2018, they proposed harmonization to the ISO 13485 standard. They said it was going to be published in the fall of 2019, and in the fall of 2019, they said it was going to be published in the fall of 2020. And then I think COVID came along and derailed everyone's plans. And so we haven't seen that yet in terms of what that harmonization will look like. Again, right now, ISO and 21 CFR 820 are non-competitive. They overlap quite a bit in lots of different areas. But there are unique requirements for both. And so we'll be really interested to keep up on FDA's efforts regarding the harmonization to the 13485 standard. The MDSAP, the single audit program. So there are real advantages to using the MDSAP program. A couple come to mind right away. One is the MDSAP, what is it? It's called the companion document, I believe. You can Google it, it's out there on the web. The MDSAP companion document walks you through the exact MDSAP audit, so you can prepare, you know what's going to happen in any given MDSAP audit. It also allows you to have one audit for a variety of regulatory bodies. So the ones that are listed here are the regulatory authorities that are that participate in the program. So if you go in and get an MDSAP audit, you can ask them to do say you want to distribute in Brazil, Canada, and the United States. They'll come in, audit for all of those regions and the specific requirements of those regions. And once you have your report, they'll submit that report to ANVISA, to Health Canada, and to the United States Food and Drug Administration. And in those cases, you can expect, if you have passing results and do a good job on your MDSAP audit, you can expect that the FDA will not come and inspect you. They'll rely on that MDSAP audit if it's successful. Now, if you get a lot of MDRs or having something strange happen, or if there's a for-cause audit, that's different. But you won't get those routine FDA audits if you're doing the MDSAP as part of that. Also, as you can imagine, with all these auditors, if you're distributing in various regions, so if you have a clearance in Japan, Canada, Australia, and the US, you don't want to host all those audits every 1 to 3 years. The MDSAP program can save your quality department a lot of time from sitting through all those various audits by just doing it all at one time under MDSAP. So those are some of the advantages for companies. It's a little bit more predictable. It cuts down on the time if you're in different markets. But again, this is not something that you have to do. So if you're just distributing in the United States, you might say, MDSAP is not worth the cost for us right now. We're just going to stick with manufacturing and distributing in the United States, and we're going to be regulated, through FDA, and FDA will do their routine inspections of us instead of the MDSAP auditor, and that's perfectly okay. Here are kind of I'm sure you guys have seen, this is like the standard kind of subsystems of a quality system. It's an icon that's used quite a lot. And these are kind of the controls. Again, you'll see a couple of these. These are based on the QSID inspection documents that FDA uses. We're not going to get too much into ISO 13485, but happy to answer any questions about those or international markets as well, just kind of focused on the US. Management responsibility is kind of the key. So you need to make sure management's responsible for providing adequate resources for design, device design, manufacturing, quality assurance, distribution, installation, servicing, etc., monitoring the quality system and making the necessary adjustments. So basically they're saying management's on the hook for they can't delegate they can't basically say, well, I didn't know about it, so it wasn't my responsibility. So, that's not my problem. It's always management's responsibility to ensure the quality system is working. And part of the way they look at it is making sure that, there's quality policy, quality manual, quality objectives, and management review. And management review is the big one. If you're not familiar with it, management review is basically a review that needs to occur at a minimum annually. And for small companies, that might be sufficient to have it annually because management will be involved a lot in the day-to-day activities of the quality system. But basically, it's kind of taking the temperature of your whole quality system and saying, what's working? What are objectives for the next year? Is everything compliant? Do we need to make any changes? Do we have enough resources? And that's really what management review is. And there's some really ISO 13485 breaks that down even further. There's some key things you have to have in every management review, but it's really just taking a look at that. Design controls. We'll spend a couple of slides on design controls because this is the place where there's a lot of, I think, confusion in terms of the overlap between design controls and pre-market requirements for your pre-market submission. And again, we kind of talked a little bit about design controls, design and development activities are different than your pre-market submission. Your pre-market submission is a deliverable within your design control process. And again, there's lots of folks out there that can help with these types of things and that understand these types of activities in terms of what are design controls and how do you comply with them. I think, again, this is a time-tested graphic. If you guys have seen anything about design controls in FDA, you'll probably have seen this exact picture. It's been used for many, many years. And this kind of demonstrates, okay, you've got your user needs, your inputs, your outputs, your reviews, your verification, your validation, et cetera. And I think that that's great. And that is it's still a very accurate graphic. But I think it's important to remember that design controls can and should be agile within any given system. So when you're having your design reviews, it's up to you to make sure that you're conducting them at the right time with the right deliverables. It's not necessarily, okay, this is exactly our line in the sand, and nothing that's starting in terms of process can start before your verification activities or something like that. So that's kind of just something to keep in mind. Controlling the design process is really important, right? Not only to ensure that you define your user needs, your intended uses, and your specific requirements, and making sure that the process is defined there. But really, a design control process should save you time and money. And that's really important to recognize, right? Because if you don't have some of these processes in place, you can do the wrong test, do test with the wrong product, not have full traceability of that product. So you have to repeat testing. All of those things are very possible, and we've actually seen with clients who have come to us. And so it's really important to get your full traceability, to make sure that you're documenting things appropriately and make sure that you have a good design control system when you're at the right time for that. And that's something that we'll talk about in a minute as well, which is right now, when to begin. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs and startups struggle with this, is when do we put in a design control process? And I think that the right time is kind of after concept. So when you're working on your concept, things should be pretty broad, right? You're doing a lot of engineering testing. Of course, you should document all of that appropriately and well, but you're not necessarily controlling all of the aspects of the design. You're still working on your requirements at that time, and that's perfectly appropriate. So there's a lot of experimentation that's happening in that concept phase. But you do need to put in design controls prior to your IDEs, when you're planning to bring a device to market, and when you're planning on partnering to bring a device to market. And I put in that last line because that's a subtle distinction as well. I think some folks who are entrepreneurs or doing a startup, they kind of think, I'm just going to get through my regulatory submission, and then I'm going to sell my product or my company. And that's great. That can certainly happen. But you still need those design controls in place to build your DHF, which is what people will look at when they're doing due diligence for your product, or really for your regulatory submission, because you want to make sure that you've got, again, full product traceability, the inputs meet the outputs. If you don't have a design control process or procedure in place, it becomes very difficult to have a successful regulatory submission. There's a question in the chat about design controls and your DHF versus the regulatory submission. So that's a little bit about that. The DHF is the design history file, and that's really the culmination of your design control process. And so your DHF contains the history of the design of your product and the testing that you've done for the product. So that includes all of that documentation that you're generating as a part of your design control activities. And that DHF, I'm so glad you brought that up, Jill, because that DHF is going to be what FDA comes in and inspects when they're looking at compliance to the design control requirements. So what goes into design controls? All of these things: design planning, design inputs, outputs, reviews, verification, validation. Unofficially, risk management needs to be a part of that. ISO 14971 is the standard for risk management, and risk management really should be complementing your design control process all the way through. And then design transfer, which is basically when you're saying, okay, now this is manufacturable product. And again, the output there is your DHF. And I have a or a listing here for change control, because I think that's so important too, especially when you're in the early phases of your product. Changes are being made all the time when you're in concept. But once you get under that design control process, those changes will still happen, but they need to be documented. And so any change that's being done after you kind of get under that design control process really needs to be examined in terms of the impact on your testing, your risks, the documentation that you've already generated. CAPAs. So CAPAs are corrective and preventative actions. CAPAs are to collect information, analyze, identify, investigate product and quality problems, and take the appropriate and effective corrective or preventive action to prevent their recurrence. CAPAs are an important part of your quality management system and of your supplier's quality management system. So making sure that they have a CAPA process as well. CAPAs do need to be documented, and there is verification or validation that is part of CAPAs as well. So when you're doing a CAPA, making sure that not only are you recognizing the problem and correcting it, but are you also analyzing the impact to the greater quality system or product? Are you identifying risks? And what types of testing need to go along with that CAPA in order to close it? Those are all things that you need to consider when you're doing corrective or preventative actions. This is definitely a place that FDA will look when they come in and do an audit, or your ISO auditors or any international regulatory bodies. It's a key part of your system to make sure that CAPAs are being completed, that they're being closed in a timely manner, and that they're being analyzed. So when you're looking at the health of your quality system, making sure that your CAPAs are not just kind of there in a vacuum, but they're being brought out into your risk management activities and what other activities they're also touching. Communicating these to the responsible people is really important. Sometimes that's even an extra step within your CAPA form or process. You know, who do you need to make aware of these events? At a minimum, you have to communicate those out at management review and also analyze and assess how your CAPA system is working. Production and process controls, this is really high level, right? But production and process controls are so important. And there's a question in the chat about changes in QMS requirements if the production is outsourced to an external manufacturer. Really good question, because that's really the case very frequently now. I think very rarely do we ever come across a medtech company, especially a startup, that's doing everything in-house. Oftentimes, various aspects of design, development, manufacture, packaging, sterilization, those are done external. And it's incumbent upon the legal manufacturer, the company, to ensure that whoever they are sourcing to do that complies with these requirements. And so that's through your supplier qualification, supplier management process. So anyone who has suppliers should have a supplier management SOP that you are using with your suppliers. And that should include appropriate qualifications based on risk. So for example, if you are buying a finished good that's being manufactured, that's high risk. They're responsible for the full product. That's definitely high risk. And that should have a really rigorous and robust quality supplier file, which would include things like their ISO certification, your audit of them, definitely having an audit for high risk suppliers, and not just one, but maybe annual or every 2 years or so, you would want to audit those people. Any other certifications that they have, your internal supplier checklists and approvals, quality agreements, supplier agreements. Those two differ subtly with the quality agreement, making sure that it encompasses the quality systems regulations, but also how are the two parties going to communicate with one another about the activities that are being performed. So for example, if you're getting complaints about your product, how is that information going back to your manufacturer when it's applicable? How is that being documented? Those are all things that the regulators will look for and will make your product better that you want to do on your own, even if no one's checking. So absolutely, the QMS requirements change if you're outsourcing those activities. So if you're not doing manufacturing, you might not need something like a facilities SOP or operations checklists or things like that. But you'll want to make sure that your supplier has those types of things, right? That your manufacturer has those types of things. And so in your supplier SOP, you're definitely going to want to define, here's how we qualify suppliers, here's how we manage suppliers, here's how we monitor suppliers. All of those things need to be done. Good question. So production and process controls. Obviously, a manufacturer has to understand when deviations from the device specifications could occur as a result of a manufacturing process or environment. And so when we're looking at things like this, and the system for determining, you need to have a system for determining whether the deviations from device specifications, yeah, sorry, that's twice there. But product and process risk analysis is so important too, right? Process validation, all of those things when you're setting up your manufacturing line. And then as your manufacturing line is running, all of those things have to happen to ensure you have controls. Having a NCR report, right? Non-conformance report, making sure that if you have deviations, those are documented and documented well. All of those things are required as part of production and process controls. And really looking at kind of the various aspects of your process, right? Are you using processes that include software or electronic equipment? Are you having equipment that's calibrated correctly? All of those things that you want to make sure are part of your process. Equipment and facility controls. We talked a little bit about equipment, but these are basic things, but you still have to make sure that management is paying attention to this and that these are appropriate, because FDA will come in, your ISO auditors will come in and say, hey, is this a suitable place to be making medical devices? Is there traceability of your product all the way from purchasing to final recipient, right? So all of those things have to be traced fully. Your purchasing procedure needs to be defined. Your incoming inspection and receiving procedures need to be defined. Inventory management, all of those things, making sure that the environment is appropriate for your product and for the manufacturer of your product is so important. And that might require special equipment, right? You might need ESD mats in various sections of your facilities, things like that. Equipment, making sure that it's calibrated, that it's logged, that it works appropriately, that you have preventative maintenance. All of those things need to happen, or you need to make sure they're happening at your manufacturer. And then records, documents, and change control. So this is just a piece that I think we have a slide, yeah, on the DHF, DMR, and DHR. So assuring that only the current documents are used and your records are maintained is so important. I think, we actually developed the ClearMark system as an electronic quality management system that includes doc control, change control, as kind of a baseline for all of these startup, mid-sized, larger medical device companies that really needed a straightforward way to make sure that their documents, records, and changes were recorded appropriately. So this is something that you'll see not just in the United States, but if you go to the EU, you're getting your MDR certification. Controlling your records is it's just foundational to any medical device company. And so that's things like revision control, signature authority, who has to sign off on what documents, why is that appropriate, where is that documented? All of those things need to be considered as you're kind of thinking about your records, your documents, and your change controls. And of course, retention periods, right? So if you have a paper system, which paper systems really only, they don't scale very well. So they only last for a period of time, but making sure that all of those documents are retained appropriately. I remember I worked at a company that was based up in New York, and there was a huge storm and document control flooded. And we were stuck with an incredible amount of work, lots of fans, trying to dry out thousands and thousands of documents and get them scanned before they molded. So things like that, making sure that you're controlling your system and your documents is so important, because documentation, I'm sure you've heard it, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And so that's really what FDA, how FDA thinks about that. A couple key records that are specifically called out in 21 CFR 820. Design history file. We talked a little bit about this, but this is the records that demonstrate the design was developed in accordance with the approved design plan and with the requirements. The DHF is the output of your design and development process. It is basically how your design has evolved from concept through transfer, your verification, your validation, all of that is contained in or referenced in your DHF. Your device master record, that's a compilation of records containing the labeling, the procedures, and specifications for the finished device. So that's things like, if you're going to make this device, how do you do that? What are the documents or records that show how you do that? So again, that's things like your labeling, your drawings, your specifications. All of those are contained in your device master record. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a binder or an electronic folder. You can have your DMR that references those documents, and that's perfectly appropriate. And then your DHR, which is a device history record. And that's the records that contain the production history of the finished device. So those are things people might call them shop travelers or work travelers or routers. And that's basically when the device is manufactured, from component to finished device, what's in it, what are the results of inspections, what are the results of any kind of phases of development, packaging, labeling, etc. That's your DHR. And even more than that, your DHR should contain post-market. If your device was returned, if you have capital equipment that's coming back and getting serviced, all that's part of a DHR as well. And then of course, complaint files as well are required. And complaint files have to contain specific information. We won't get into that because I don't know if anybody's truly post-market yet, but we can certainly talk about that. Just keep in mind that you have to have complaint files and a procedure for handling incoming events and complaints. There's a question on documenting lab tests in lab notebooks. And the lab tests in lab notebooks, that's a really good question. Do hand notes need to be scanned into our system? Yes, so in the ClearMark system, we support any kind of attachment type. You can scan your results right in there, and that's great. Or you can reference those in your lab notebooks, depending on what they are. So lab tests, that's a really broad category, but in general, if you're doing concept work and want to leave things in lab notebooks, and those lab notebooks are maintained and signed and all of those things accordingly, that can be perfectly appropriate. When you're getting into verification and validation, typically you want full protocols and test reports that have all of the data scanned or reproduced within that test protocol or report so that it stands alone. So that's kind of the distinction. Lab notebooks are certainly useful. Again, I feel like in concept work, we use them all the time, and it's a lot more common. When you do get into verification and validation, under your official design controls, you're going to want those protocols and reports to be comprehensive, and typically not leave a lot in the lab notebook. Question on medical device file, DMR or DHF or technical file. Good question. So there's lots of different references here to different files. These three that we see here, the DHF, the DMR, and the DHR, those are all, again, called out by FDA in 21 CFR 820. When we're looking at a technical file, that's slightly different. So that's actually the file for the EU for your MDR application. That file has different requirements and specifications than, let's say, your DHF, which would be kind of the most equivalent out of all of these, but it's slightly different. The technical file, again, just has different content. Things like the essential requirements have to be in the tech file that are specific to your product in the EU. Again, a lot of these terms have overlapping content. So for example, you're going to have all of your labels that are listed in your DHF that'll also be listed in your technical file. You will have your verification, your validation, all those will be listed in both, but they take on a little bit of a different form or format depending on the place that they're being compiled. Now, in order to remediate that, the International Medical Devices Global Task Force has come out with the STED file. And the STED file is the standard technical something document. STED files are basically the file that you're supposed to be able to use for any jurisdiction. And the harmonization on that has been slow, but there is a new file format. Health Canada will only accept STED file, the table of contents format, for certain device types. So there is an effort for harmonization, so we're not dealing with all of these disparate terms. Again, the harmonization to 1345 is supposed to be, it should be helpful for kind of minimizing the amount of terms on all this, because it is a lot to keep straight in terms of the different types of records. A few items on QMS considerations. So when you're looking at a QMS or just starting your quality management system, I think, of course, it needs to be compliant, but it really should serve your business. So hopefully when you're looking at this, you're not thinking, oh my goodness, this is just a huge amount of infrastructure, time, and expense for nothing. It's really not. First and foremost is to ensure the quality of your medical devices. But it should actually, again, save you time and money. That's the goal, right? Is that by ensuring quality, you're preventing costly errors, such as the need for repeat testing, or, hopefully not, a recall or something like that. So the QMS should really serve your business and improve your business. It should also be customized to your needs, right? Which functions are you performing versus outsourcing? We talked a little bit about this. You don't need SOPs that cover tasks that you're not performing. In fact, you really shouldn't have them. Like if you're not performing servicing, you shouldn't have an SOP for servicing, and that's great. If you're not performing design control activities, you just need to make sure that your supplier, who you are delegating that responsibility to, that you've shown that they can perform design control responsibilities in accordance with the regulation. And that's, of course, as part of your audit and part of your supplier agreement. And then how is your QMS structured for your specific team? Again, the quality management system at a Ethicon, at J&J, at Baxter, those look a lot different than the quality management system for a startup with 10 people. they're going to look different, and they should. So definitely making sure your QMS is customized to your specific needs. And then that it evolves as well, right? So your quality management system is not static. Your SOPs should be getting lots of revisions as you grow, as you expand product lines, and as you expand capabilities. So for example, you might start out with just a handful of SOPs when you're in concept work, right? Maybe you've got your quality manual, dot control, change control, and training. And then as you get into design control, you add on design control, risk management, supplier approval, because you're starting to think about those types of things. So making sure that your quality management system evolves with your company is so key. And then of course, international considerations. So when you're thinking about international markets, what are the compliance activities required there? Do you need an ISO 13485 certification? Do you want to do the MDSAP program? Will those things be valuable to your company? And what are the requirements there? All super important. And just in terms of international as well, those international regulatory bodies will require you to state their specific country regulations in your quality manual and in your procedures. Just something to keep in mind. And then the key question of when to implement, right? And again, this looks different for all sorts of companies, but you have to have a QMS in place to accomplish your design and development activities, right? And that's that kind of what's concept or research versus what's verification, validation, design process. Making that distinction can be hard, and it's not something that if you are very early concept that you should be putting into place yet. You should put it into place when you're getting into formal design control activities. And that's just helpful. I think a lot of folks do wait, and then you are kind of trying to retrofit documentation in, which you can do, but it is difficult. And I think just making sure that you're kind of thinking about that in advance is so key. Again, starting early in your product life cycle ensures efficiency, organization, quality. Hopefully it saves you time and money. Make sure you have a good regulatory submission that's going in. I will say sometimes when we come into projects and there's no controls in place, that makes that regulatory submission much more costly and difficult, just because there's the document control isn't there, the traceability isn't there. We identify gaps later in the game than you would have caught them up front. And then again, consider implementing those in a phased-in approach. So when you're thinking about starting your design and development activities, you don't need a complaint procedure in place yet, right? You don't need a returns procedure in place yet because you're just not at that phase yet. And I say here, you might want to consider using quality plan. So just having a quality plan documenting, here's how we're going to implement our quality management system. Here's when we're going to put these SOPs in place. Here's when we're going to put these SOPs in place. And that kind of demonstrates that the activities that you're conducting are all being conducted under that quality system regulation and are compliant. So that kind of wraps up our section on quality management systems. We do have some time to talk about that, but here are just a couple of resources. First of all, reach out at any time. We love to talk to people. You can contact me directly, Alison@regulatorymark.com. If you want a demo of our ClearMark software, you can reach out to Lauren at QMS.com, or you can reach out to me. And we'd love to show you some of the platform that we have in place that's an electronic platform to help companies hopefully easily comply with these requirements and kind of navigate that space of quality systems requirements. I always encourage people, check out CDRH. If you're new to this space, the CDRH Learn module is really good. It's got a lot of different training modules that you can see for everything from establishment, registration, and listing to process controls to lots of different modules on that website. So definitely check that out. Searching the FDA guidance documents is always good. There's lots of good guidance that's been published, even if it's older guidance. So for example, some of the software guidance that we deal with is a little bit older. It is still very valuable. So definitely look into the FDA guidance documents or have your regulatory person do that. And then recognized standards. So making sure you understand the standards that are applicable to your device. And that's just a link where you can search FDA's recognized standards as well. I do want to say a quick thank you to the state of Ohio and Parallax for this presentation today and organizing everything and allowing us this opportunity to interact. So thank you very much to Ohio and Parallax, and again to the Entrepreneur Center. And now I think we will open up for questions. We have a few more minutes left for questions. So feel free to ask away.
Allison, I do think there's a few in the chat. Did you already see those?
Let's see. I did address, I was trying to address as we go. Let me scroll up a little. Yeah, I think we talked about some of that documentation and record keeping. I think one of the key things that this surrounds too, I saw a couple questions in terms of outsourcing. And just to kind of let you know, if you are having trouble with like a quality agreement or just understanding what your obligations are with suppliers, do give us a call or look into, you know, the quality systems regulations and things like that. There's a lot of good information that's out there. And so feel free to reach out to us at any time. Oh, and there was a question, what services do we offer? So Regulatory Mark is our regulatory and quality consulting service. We have a team of now 7 people that can assist you with anything from regulatory strategy for your product to your pre-market submissions or applications, to questions about your quality management systems or procedures. So all things kind of quality regulatory that are going through CDRH, we can help you out with. Or if we can't, we certainly know experts who we can refer you to as well. We also have with our ClearMark product, and that was, if you want a demo of our software, you can reach out to Lauren or me. The ClearMark platform, it's clearmarkqms.com, and that's an electronic quality management system that was designed specifically for medtech companies. So basically we saw that a lot of our clients were having the same troubles again and again with their quality management system. So we automated a lot of that on a cloud-based platform, and that's all Part 11 compliant for electronic signatures and all of that good stuff. Happy to tell you more about that. Question, how is user-generated health data regulated? Wearable health monitor, data stored in the cloud. Who's responsible for privacy protection in that case? That is such a good question, because I just had a conversation with a HIPAA lawyer earlier last week, because HIPAA is a separate space from FDA regulation, and it's so important to consider when you're thinking about your medical product. Now, if a user is uploading their own data to your software or platform, HIPAA does not apply. Privacy protections apply, but not HIPAA. HIPAA really comes into play when a provider, a covered provider, is sharing data with another entity. So for example, if you're getting health data, PHI, from a hospital into your software platform, you need a business associate agreement with that provider to ensure HIPAA compliance. If the data, again, if the user is just uploading their own data into your system, you do not need that sort of agreement. Now, you do need privacy protections and things like that. There are lots of complicated things that I don't know about, like response planning if there's a breach and things like that, that a HIPAA or cybersecurity lawyer will be able to tell you about. And if you do want a connection to one of those, I know there is a very good one. There's 2, their names are not coming to mind. But if you email me, I will be able to get those to you. So really good question, especially in terms of software platforms. You know, and one quick thing to mention also that we didn't kind of cover up front, in terms of your product and the product regulation, there are also products that are exempt or use enforcement discretion with FDA. So when we're looking at some of these health technologies and wellness technologies, there are certain exemptions where they might technically meet the definition of a medical device, but are exempt from FDA oversight because FDA has said these products are low risk enough that we're not going to regulate those. So if you do have kind of a health wellness tech kind of product, there's two guidances that you should look at. One is mobile medical apps. The other is general wellness products. And you should definitely check those out, or call us and we can talk to you about that as well. So all good things to kind of keep in mind as you're starting your process. Any other questions? Or are people going to get back a few minutes of their day?
Say going once, going twice.
Oh, there's a question. So a Bluetooth scale would be a general medical device. Can you provide a little bit more information on that? I'm not familiar with that, a Bluetooth scale.
I was gonna say, Chris, if you want, feel free to unmute and chat directly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Happy to chat.
Okay, so the concept would be a scale that would log to your phone, like, so you wanted to do a Weight Watchers type application. You did daily weigh-ins, okay?
Yep.
And so a scale that would be paired to your phone and you would weigh every morning, that sort of thing. That would be not from my perspective, that's sort of just an ancillary thing that's no different than writing your weight on a pad, except that it's automated rather than
right.
And so that would be like I don't know that I'm pretty sure that scales, unless they're used in like hospital settings, are not FDA approved. Okay?
Yep. That is such a good question, because you are right on the money. The FDA has actually said, as one of their examples in their general wellness document, that weight loss apps, which of course commercially available, lots of weight loss programs, things like that, those don't go through the FDA, but they actually give that as an example of something that would be exempt, because that is a question that people have had. So absolutely a good question on that. I will say, so you're correct, that would be exempt, but it does bear looking into, because certainly if you were making medical claims, that could change, right? So if you were making particular claims about, let's say you had an app and you were talking about weight loss for patients with diabetes and were making diagnostic recommendations, that would be a medical device. So it really depends on what your product's doing. As just a scale or a log or a tracker, generally you're exempt, even if you're tracking health information, right? And so in those two guidance documents that I mentioned, they really have some decent examples and some good outlines of what's exempt from FDA oversight and what's not when you have an application or some kind of software. And the kind of area that it centers around is it low risk, and is it for general wellness or maintaining a general state of good health? And if there's some caveats, if you were mentioning specific disease states, is that information well known? So definitely a good question. And whenever you're looking at kind of like data and applications, making sure that you're considering an app can be a medical device, even if it doesn't have hardware associated with it. It's a good question, Chris. Thanks for that.
So we got a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask Alison some specific questions about your devices or your ideas.
And if you guys have questions that come up after, I think this was a lot of information. So if you have any questions that arise after you've thought about it for a while, again, feel free to reach out at any time. And Audrey, I don't know, are we posting this?
Yes, so we will post this on YouTube, and I'll share that link so you can come back and revisit the presentation. Alison, we've also had a couple of requests in the chat for the slide deck if you're willing to share that. So
absolutely.
If you registered via Eventbrite, I have your email. If you stumbled in here somehow without going through Eventbrite, but want the follow-up, make sure you drop your email in the chat and I'll grab those. But yeah, we'll send a follow-up and connect you all with Alison. We'll share the link for this this workshop, this presentation, and then I'll attach those slides as well. So if you have some questions that pop up later as you start to process some of this information, we'll connect you that way. I think I guess there's one more question.
It looks like there's one more experience on AI submissions. I think it's AI. Is that right? Or is it IA? I don't know IA, but I do know AI. If it's asking for AI product submission experience, we actually do. And that is a very interesting area. As you know, FDA has 2 position papers out about AI. And so we'd be happy to discuss that with you. Of course, AI has some very particular nuance to it and testing and things like that that you want to be careful with the FDA. And so happy to talk with you about that in a lot more detail because those are really interesting submissions at this point. Depends on a lot. There's a lot of different applications. And there was just a de novo cleared, I think, this week with a new AI platform. So we're always keeping an eye on that stuff to make sure we've got the most recent information. And thank you all for your great questions today. I really appreciate your time. I know you're all very busy, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Alison, for sharing this wealth of information and sharing your expertise. We appreciate your support of our medtech entrepreneur community.
Thank you so much. It's a great community to be a part of. We love seeing what all these people are coming up with. It's really a pleasure. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.